The Hurtgen Forest, Germany. The middle of November 1944. A soldier of the German 7th Army lies at the bottom of a foxhole he has spent the better part of a day improving. He has done everything his training told him would keep him alive. He has dug deep, below the level where a shell that strikes the earth throws its fragments outward and upward. He has cut logs from the pines around him and laid them across the top of the hole, then piled soil over the timber. Overhead, the forest canopy is so dense that Allied aircraft cannot see him, and neither can the artillery observers, who might otherwise call fire onto his position. He is cold, and he is frightened, but he understands the arithmetic of survival in a bombardment. When the shells begin to fall, a man who is below ground and under cover is a man the fragments mostly miss. He has watched it happen. He has seen the earth erupt a few meters away and felt the pressure of it in his chest and lived, because the steel went past him and over him rather than into him. Then the American guns open, and the arithmetic he has trusted for years simply stops working. The shells do not strike the ground. They burst in the air above the trees, 30 feet over his head, and the fragments come down. They come down into the foxhole. They come down through the gap between the logs. They come down onto the men, crouched at the bottom of positions that had protected them from every barrage before this one. There is no lower place to go. The cover he built assumed the danger came from the side and from the front, from steel traveling parallel to the ground. This steel is falling straight down out of the sky, and the deeper he digs, the more perfectly he has shaped a container to catch it. When the American infantry come forward afterward and look into the German positions, they find men who died in postures of shelter, curled at the bottom of holes that had been built with real skill, killed by an enemy who in many cases never saw them and never needed to. This is a strange way to die, and the men who survived it said so. In interrogation after interrogation that winter, captured German soldiers described the same impossible thing. They had been under cover, they had done everything correctly, and the shells had found them anyway, bursting overhead where nothing was supposed to burst, defeating a form of protection that had been reliable since the first industrial bombardments of the previous World War. One German account described soldiers left dazed and shaking, insisting there had been simply no defense against it. It is a peculiar complaint from a soldier, because it is not the complaint of a man who was outfought. It is the complaint of a man who did everything right and was killed regardless, by a weapon whose logic he could not understand and his own army could not answer. The scale of it was not small. Across the last winter of the war in Europe, from the Hurtgen Forest through the Ardennes and beyond, American field artillery, firing this new kind of shell, inflicted casualties on German infantry at rates that shocked the men on the receiving end and delighted the commanders directing it. General George Patton, a man who was famously reluctant to credit any piece of equipment over the fighting spirit of his soldiers, made an exception for this one. He wrote that the new shell was devastating, that it might force every army in the world to invent new methods of warfare once the secret was out, and he was glad the Americans had thought of it first. When a commander like Patton says a weapon has changed the fundamental math of combat, it is worth asking exactly what the weapon was and why the German army, which was in most respects the most tactically sophisticated fighting force of the war, had no answer to it at all. So here is the question this account exists to answer. Why did German troops, dug in, under cover, doing everything their hard experience had taught them, suddenly find that cover no longer saved them? And why could the German army, with its brilliant engineers and its formidable industrial base, not simply build the same thing and do it back? The answer is not that American gunners were better shots. It is not that German soldiers were careless or German cover was poorly built. In many cases, the German positions were excellent, dug by veterans who had survived years of Allied bombardment precisely because they knew how to disappear into the earth. The answer has almost nothing to do with the battlefield at all. It has to do with a small glass tube full of vacuum, a radio transmitter smaller than a fist, and a decision made in a laboratory in the United States years before these men died, a decision to solve a problem that most of the world's weapons engineers had quietly concluded could not be solved. To understand why the German soldier in that foxhole died, you have to understand a piece of engineering so difficult that Germany's own ordnance experts had looked at it, judged it impossible with the technology available, and moved on. They were wrong, and the price of being wrong was paid, that winter, by their own infantry. Before we get to the laboratory, it is worth taking the problem seriously on its own terms, because the thing the Americans were trying to build was genuinely, almost absurdly hard. To understand why, you have to understand what artillery had been struggling to do for the previous 30 years. An artillery shell kills in one of two ways. It can strike something solid and detonate on contact, or it can be set to explode in the air above its target. The contact shell is simple and reliable, but against troops who are dug in it is also deeply inefficient. When a shell hits the ground, a great deal of its energy is absorbed by the earth, and most of its fragments are hurled outward and upward in a rough cone. A man lying flat, or crouched in a trench, or curled at the bottom of a foxhole, is below the worst of that cone. The ground itself shields him. This is the oldest lesson of modern bombardment, learned in the trenches of the First World War and drilled into every soldier since. When the shells come, get down and get below the surface, and the steel will mostly pass over you. The airburst was the answer to the man who had gotten down. A shell that explodes in the air, some tens of feet above the ground, sends its fragments downward, into the trench, into the foxhole, onto the men who thought they were safe. The airburst does not care that a soldier is below ground level, because it attacks him from above. Every artillery officer understood this. The problem was making it happen at the right moment. A shell fired from a distant gun travels for many seconds before it arrives, and to make it burst at exactly the right height above a target miles away, gunners had to calculate the time of flight with great precision and set a mechanical timer in the nose of the shell before firing. That timer was the weak point. A mechanical time fuse, or a powder-burning one, was a blunt instrument. The gunner had to know the exact range, the exact air temperature and pressure, the exact behavior of that particular batch of propellant, and even then, the burst height varied from shell to shell. Set the timer a fraction too long, and the shell buried itself in the ground before exploding, wasting all its downward killing potential. Set it a fraction too short, and it burst harmlessly high in the air, scattering its fragments over so wide an area that they arrived spent and ineffective. Getting a useful airburst out of a time fuse required a skilled forward observer to watch the bursts, judge how high they were, and correct the timing round by round, a slow process that gave the enemy time to take cover before the gunners found the right height. Against a fleeting target, or in weather where the observer could not see his own bursts, reliable airburst fire was often simply impossible. What every artilleryman wanted was a shell that knew, all by itself, when it had reached the right height above the ground, or the right distance from a target, and detonated at that instant without any human having to calculate or guess. A shell that carried its own senses, a shell that could tell how close it was to the thing it was meant to destroy. This idea was obvious. Everyone wanted it. The reason nobody had it was that building it seemed to lie somewhere between extraordinarily difficult and flatly impossible. Consider what such a shell would have to contain. It would need a way to detect the ground or a target, which in practice meant a tiny radio transmitter and receiver, broadcasting a signal and listening for the echo that bounced back, measuring the change in that echo as the distance closed. In the late 1930s, radio equipment that could do this filled cabinets and required delicate glass vacuum tubes, the fragile electronic valves that were the beating heart of every radio of the age. These tubes were made of thin glass and fine wire. They were designed to sit undisturbed on a shelf in a warm room. Now imagine taking that entire delicate radio apparatus, shrinking it until it fit inside the nose of an artillery shell a few inches wide, and then firing it out of a cannon. The forces involved are difficult to comprehend. When the propellant charge ignites behind a shell, the projectile is slammed forward with an acceleration on the order of 20,000 times the force of gravity. Everything inside the shell suddenly weighs 20,000 times what it weighs at rest. A component that weighs a fraction of an ounce briefly weighs the equivalent of many pounds, crushing down on whatever supports it. And that is only the beginning. The rifling grooves inside the gun barrel grip the shell and spin it for stability, so that as it leaves the muzzle, it is rotating at somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 revolutions per minute. A delicate glass vacuum tube, its fine internal wires, suddenly weighing thousands of times their normal weight, is asked to survive being crushed and flung into a spin fast enough to tear most machinery apart, and then to keep working perfectly, transmitting and receiving radio signals, for the entire time the shell is in flight. This is the problem that Germany's ordnance engineers examined and set aside. It is worth being precise here, because the popular version of this story flattens it into a simple claim that the Germans thought it was impossible and gave up. The truth is more interesting and more instructive. German scientists and engineers were not fools, and they did not ignore the idea of a proximity fuse. In fact, over the course of the war, German research establishments investigated a remarkable range of approaches to the problem, dozens of separate designs based on radio, on acoustics, on the electrical properties of the air around a shell, on light and on heat. Some of these were ingenious, a few were genuinely advanced. The variety alone tells you the Germans understood exactly how valuable such a fuse would be, especially for shooting down the Allied bombers that were steadily reducing German cities to rubble. There were designs that worked on the electrical field around the shell, sensing the disturbance caused by a nearby aircraft. There were acoustic designs meant to listen for the drone of an engine and detonate as the sound peaked. There were photoelectric schemes meant to react to the shadow or the light of a target, and designs based on heat, and designs based on radio waves, much like the American approach. On paper, German ingenuity was more than equal to the concept. The country that produced the first jet aircraft and the first ballistic missile was not short of clever engineers, and the sheer number of proximity fuse projects the Germans pursued shows they grasped the prize as clearly as anyone. But grasping the prize and seizing it are different things. Almost none of these German designs ever came close to the battlefield, and the ones that advanced furthest were still nowhere near the reliability and the mass production that a real weapon demands. The German efforts were scattered across many firms and many competing ideas, without the single ruthless focus that the Americans brought to bear. And they kept running into the same wall the Americans had spent years and a fortune climbing over, the wall of building electronics rugged enough and small enough and cheap enough to be fired from a gun in enormous numbers. The German firm Rheinmetall pursued a field-sensing design, and other exotic schemes were tried besides. But time and again the projects stalled short of production. But none of them ever reached the battlefield in numbers that mattered, and the reasons are a lesson in how wars are won and lost far from the front line. Early in the conflict, when Germany was winning and victory seemed near, the German leadership set a broad priority policy that concentrated resources on weapons that could be finished and fielded quickly, and curtailed longer-term projects that could not be delivered within a short window. Proximity fuse work was only one of many efforts swept aside by that policy, alongside other advanced research that might have paid off later. Proximity fuse research, difficult and slow, fell into the category of things that could wait, and much of it was set aside at exactly the moment the Americans and British were pouring resources into it. When German researchers returned to the problem later in the war, they had lost precious time, and they never solved the central engineering challenge that the Americans did solve, the challenge of building radio electronics rugged enough and small enough and cheap enough to be fired from a gun by the millions. German industry, increasingly starved of raw materials and skilled labor and hammered from the air, could not have mass-produced such a thing even if the design had been finished. So the German assessment was not simply that the fuse was impossible. It was a series of choices, some reasonable in the moment and disastrous in hindsight, that left the German army without a weapon its enemies were about to use against it. The Germans concluded the game was not worth the candle. The Americans concluded the opposite, and then they did something that is genuinely remarkable in the history of wartime engineering. They took the impossible thing and they built it, and then they built more than 22 million of them. If accounts like this one, the hidden engineering that decided battles, are the kind of history you find worth your time, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed history reach more people who care about getting it right. The idea did not begin in America. Like a surprising number of the war's decisive technologies, the concept of a radio proximity fuse was first seriously explored by British scientists in the desperate early years, when Britain stood alone and was searching for any technical edge that might blunt the German advantage in the air. British researchers had worked out the underlying principle, a fuse that would broadcast a radio signal and detonate when the reflected echo from a nearby aircraft grew strong enough. They had even tested crude versions in rockets, which accelerate gently enough that fragile electronics can survive the launch. But Britain in 1940 was fighting for its life and had neither the industrial capacity nor the spare scientific manpower to turn a promising principle into a mass-produced weapon. So the British did something that changed the war. In the autumn of 1940, a delegation crossed the Atlantic, carrying a metal trunk filled with Britain's most closely guarded technical secrets, offered to the still neutral United States in exchange for American industrial muscle. This was the Tizard mission, named for the scientist who led it, and the trunk it carried has been called one of the most valuable cargoes ever to reach American shores. Inside, among the secrets of radar and jet propulsion, was the concept of the proximity fuse. The British handed the Americans the idea. What the Americans did with it was to solve every problem the idea contained. The work was handed to a new organization created to mobilize American science for war, and within it, to a group that would come to be known simply as Section T. Its driving force was a physicist named Merle Tuve, a brilliant and demanding man who understood from the outset that this was not really a physics problem. The physics of a radio proximity fuse was, in Tuve's own later assessment, well understood. The problem was engineering of the most brutal and unglamorous kind. It was the problem of making delicate things survive violence. Tuve gathered a team that would grow from a handful of people into an enterprise of some 800. Working first at the Carnegie Institution in Washington and then at a new laboratory established under Johns Hopkins University, the Applied Physics Laboratory, which was created essentially to house this single overwhelming effort. Beyond that core laboratory, the wider program eventually drew in thousands more across dozens of contractors and factories. The central obstacle was the vacuum tube. No tube in existence could survive being fired from a gun, so the team designed new ones. Tiny, rugged tubes descended from the miniature valves used in hearing aids, built to withstand forces that would pulverize an ordinary component. A young physicist on the team named James Van Allen, who would later become famous for discovering the belts of radiation that circle the Earth and now bear his name, did much of the punishing work of making these tubes survive. The team braced and cushioned the delicate electronics against the shock. They tested and failed and redesigned, firing prototype after prototype and digging the shattered remains out of the ground to see what had broken. The failures, in the early days, were almost total. When the team began firing their first experimental fuses from guns, the survival rate was dismal. The tubes shattered. The wires tore loose. The tiny filaments inside the tubes, thinner than a human hair, snapped under the sudden weight of acceleration. Every firing was a small autopsy. The engineers would recover what was left of the fuse, examine the wreckage under magnification, identify the part that had failed first, redesign it, and fire again. Progress came not in a flash of insight, but in a long grind of elimination, one broken component at a time. What made it maddening was that a fuse had to survive not one violent event, but a whole sequence of them in the space of a heartbeat. First, the crushing setback of the propellant charge, then the brutal spin imparted by the rifling, then the long flight, during which the delicate radio had to keep functioning through vibration and temperature change. And then, at the far end, it had to be sensitive enough to detect the faint radio echo from a target, and fast enough to fire in the final instant. Every one of those demands pulled against the others. Making a tube rugged enough to survive the gun tended to make it too crude to sense a target. Making it sensitive enough to sense a target tended to make it too fragile to survive the gun. The team had to satisfy both at once, in a device small enough to fit in a shell nose and cheap enough to throw away by the million. They solved it with 1,000 small ingenuities. They embedded the components in protective material so that nothing could flex or shift under load. They arranged the parts so that the forces of firing pressed them together rather than pulling them apart. They learned which shapes of glass survived and which shattered, which wire gauges held, and which parted. Slowly, firing by firing, the survival rate climbed from almost nothing toward the reliability a real weapon required. It was some of the least glamorous and most consequential engineering of the entire war, a triumph not of a single brilliant idea, but of relentless, patient, unforgiving refinement. Even the battery was a problem that demanded invention. An ordinary battery would go flat sitting in an ammunition dump, and the shells might sit for months before being fired. So the team designed a battery that stored no charge at all until the moment of firing. Inside each fuse was a small glass vial of chemical electrolyte and a stack of dry battery plates. When the shell was fired, the shock of setback shattered the glass vial, and the spinning of the shell flung the liquid outward and spread it across the plates. And only then, in the last seconds of the shell's life, did the battery come alive and power the little radio in the nose. It meant the shells could be stored for very long periods without their batteries going flat, and would spring to life only when fired. It was an elegant solution to a problem most people would never even have thought to worry about. What emerged from all this labor was a device of astonishing sophistication, disguised as a lump of steel. Inside the nose of an otherwise ordinary artillery shell sat a miniature radio transmitter, continuously broadcasting a signal as the shell flew. As the shell approached its target, whether an aircraft in the sky or the ground beneath it, the signal reflected back, and the returning echo mixed with the outgoing signal to produce a rhythmic beat that grew stronger and faster as the distance closed. When that beat reached the intensity that meant the shell had arrived at the killing distance, a gas-filled switching tube fired, closing the circuit, triggering the detonator, and exploding the shell at precisely the right moment, without any human being having calculated anything at all. Each fuse contained something like 130 separate electronic components, a miniature radio station packed into a space smaller than a drinking glass, mass-produced to survive 20,000 times the force of gravity, and a spin of tens of thousands of revolutions a minute. The scale of the manufacturing effort matched the difficulty of the design. This was not a laboratory curiosity produced in small numbers. Solving the design was only half the battle. The other half was making the fuse by the tens of thousands every single day, using the ordinary electronics industry of the United States, the companies that in peacetime built radios and refrigerators and light bulbs. Nearly 90 separate firms across more than 100 factories were eventually drawn into some part of the work, including the great names of American electronics and manufacturing. Production began as a trickle, just a few hundred fuses a day at the end of 1942. By the following year, it had climbed to tens of thousands daily, and by the end of the war, American factories were turning out on the order of 70,000 proximity fuses every day. In total, more than 22 million of them were built before the war ended. The whole enterprise cost more than $1 billion, an enormous sum for the time, and it was guarded with a secrecy that ranks alongside the effort to build the atomic bomb. Only a handful of programs in the entire American war effort were held as closely as this one. And that secrecy is the key to the next part of the story, because it explains a strange fact. The Americans had this remarkable weapon in hand for nearly 2 years before they allowed it to be fired at the German infantry it would prove so lethal against. The reason was fear, a very specific and well-founded fear that the secret would escape. The proximity fuse first went to war not on land but at sea, and not against soldiers but against aircraft, which was the target its inventors had most urgently in mind. Against airplanes, the fuse was transformative. Shooting down an aircraft with conventional anti-aircraft fire meant filling the sky with bursting shells and hoping that one of them happened to explode close enough to do damage, a matter of luck that consumed staggering quantities of ammunition for every aircraft destroyed. The proximity fuse changed that. Now a shell only had to pass near the aircraft, and it would sense the target and burst at the closest point of approach, throwing its fragments into the airframe. The very first combat success came in the Pacific on January 5, 1943, when a shell fired by the cruiser Helena, one of the first ships issued the new ammunition, knocked a Japanese dive bomber out of the sky. It was the opening demonstration of a weapon that would reshape naval air defense. The results, once studied, were dramatic and lopsided. In the fighting of that year, proximity fuzzed shells made up only a modest share of the anti-aircraft rounds American ships fired, yet they accounted for roughly half of the aircraft shot down. Measured another way, it took the older time fused shells hundreds upon hundreds of rounds to bring down a single aircraft, while the proximity fused shells did the same work with a fraction of that expenditure. By the standard of the men who had to defend a ship against air attack, the difference was the difference between hoping and killing. The chief scientist behind the American research effort would later estimate that the fuse had multiplied the effectiveness of the fleet's anti-aircraft fire several-fold. For a warship crew watching enemy planes bore in, that multiplier was measured in survival. But the ships fired their shells over open water. A shell that missed its target and did not detonate simply fell into the sea, its secret sealed forever beneath the waves. This was the whole reason the Navy was allowed to use the fuse first. The commanders who controlled the weapon lived in dread of a single scenario. If proximity-fuzzed shells were fired over land, then sooner or later a shell would fail to explode, a dud, and it would bury itself in the soft earth more or less intact. If that happened over enemy territory, or over territory that might fall to the enemy, then German engineers might dig it up, take it apart, and discover the secret. And the secret, once discovered, could be turned around. If the Germans learned how to build proximity fuses, they might equip their own anti-aircraft guns with them, and the consequences for the Allied bombers flying over Germany, and for the transport aircraft that would one day drop paratroopers over the continent, could be catastrophic. The judgment was made at the highest levels that the advantage of surprise, held in reserve for the moment it would matter most, was worth more than the tactical benefit of using the fuse early over land. So the fuse was kept on its leash. It defended ships in the Pacific, where its value only grew as the war went on, and the Japanese turned to suicide attacks, sending piloted aircraft deliberately into American ships. Against a man determined to crash his plane into a carrier, the old anti-aircraft fire that merely damaged an aircraft was often not enough, because a damaged plane could still complete its dive. The proximity fuse, bursting close and throwing a dense cloud of fragments into the airframe, was far more likely to destroy the attacker outright before it arrived. Sailors came to regard the little fuse as one of the things standing between them and a burning ship. Then the weapon was released to help defend England against a new German terror, the V-1 flying bomb, a small pilotless aircraft powered by a pulsing jet engine that Germany launched by the thousands against London in the summer of 1944. The flying bomb was a genuinely difficult target. It flew low and it flew fast, faster than many of the fighters sent up to chase it, and it came in a steady stream, day and night, each one carrying a heavy warhead toward a city full of people. Stopping it demanded gunnery of a precision that had never quite been possible before, because the bombs were small and quick and gave the gunners very little time. The proximity fuse changed the equation, but it did not do so instantly, and the story of how it did is a small lesson in how a weapon and the men using it have to learn each other. When the fused shells first went into action against the flying bombs, the results were promising, but not overwhelming. Then the whole defensive scheme was reorganized. The heavy anti-aircraft guns were moved down to the coast, where they could fire out over the sea at the incoming bombs. Radar was tied into the gun laying, and the new fuses were fed to the batteries in quantity. From that point, the success rate climbed steeply, week after week, as the gunners mastered the technique and the equipment settled into a rhythm. In the first week of the reorganized defense, the guns were knocking down a modest fraction of the bombs that came within reach. By the end of the campaign, they were destroying the overwhelming majority, a transformation that the commander of Britain's anti-aircraft defenses attributed directly to the proximity fuse. It was, he said, the thing that had made those near-perfect results possible. And crucially, the flying bombs came in over the sea, so a shell that missed and failed to detonate fell into the water, and the secret held. The same logic that had permitted the fuse over the open Pacific permitted its use here, over the Channel, against the buzzing bombs aimed at London. The secret was still, just barely, being kept. But a weapon this powerful could not be held back from the land battle forever, and by the end of 1944 the situation that had justified the restriction was changing. The strategic calculation had always been a balance, and it had been argued over at the highest levels for a long time. On one side sat the risk that Germany would capture and copy the fuse, and turn it against Allied bombers and transport planes with potentially disastrous results. On the other sat the enormous killing power the fuse would bring to the field artillery, the branch that inflicted the majority of all casualties in the entire war. For 2 years the guardians of the secret had come down firmly on the side of caution. The advantage of surprise, they judged, was a thing you could spend only once, and it should be spent at the moment of greatest possible effect, not frittered away in engagements that could be won by other means. As the Allied armies pressed toward Germany itself, that judgment began to shift. Planners started preparing to release the fuse for general use on the ground, with a target date around the end of the year. Part of the reasoning was simple mathematics of time. Germany was now so battered, so short of materials and skilled labor, and time itself, so relentlessly bombed, that even if a fuse fell into German hands intact, the German war machine could not realistically reverse engineer it, tool up for it, and field it in meaningful numbers before the war was over. The window in which the secret was worth protecting was closing on its own. The surprise that had been hoarded so carefully for 2 years could finally be spent, and the moment to spend it was approaching. What no one on the Allied side yet knew was that the Germans were about to choose that very moment to launch the last great offensive of the war in the West, and in doing so, hand the Americans the perfect occasion to unleash the weapon they had been saving. Then, on December 16, 1944, the German army did something no one on the Allied side expected. It attacked. The great German offensive in the Ardennes, the assault that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, threw the American lines into chaos and confusion. Through the fog and snow of the densely wooded hills, German armored columns drove westward, and the sudden crisis swept away the careful timetable for introducing the new fuse. The restriction on firing proximity fused shells over land was lifted within a couple of days of the German attack. General Eisenhower himself formally requested clearance, and the authorization came back quickly. The weapon that had been held in reserve for 2 years was suddenly, urgently needed. It was released into the hands of the American field artillery in the middle of the largest battle the American army fought in the entire war. The Americans had prepared for this moment more thoroughly than the sudden release might suggest. Stocks of the ground version of the ammunition had already been shipped to the continent in anticipation of the day the restriction would lift, so that when the order came, there were rounds on hand to fire. The army even had a code name ready for the ground-fired fuse, a security precaution to keep the nature of the ammunition obscured in orders and radio traffic. What had been missing was not the shells but the permission, and the German offensive swept that final obstacle away in the space of a few days. It is important to be accurate about what happened next, because the popular telling of this story tends toward exaggeration, and the truth does not need it. The proximity fuse did not, by itself, win the Battle of the Bulge. The battle was won by many things, by the stubborn defense of crossroads towns, by the men who held Bastogne, by the eventual clearing of the skies that let Allied air power fall on the German columns, by fuel shortages that stranded German tanks, and by the broad weight of American and Allied strength. The official army histories are careful on this point, noting that in the opening weeks of the battle, the new fuse was actually used only on a limited number of occasions, often at night or in poor weather, precisely the conditions in which the older method of adjusting airburst fire by eye did not work. The fuse was not a magic wand waved over the battlefield, it was one powerful new tool introduced in the middle of a desperate fight. But where it was used, its effect on German infantry was exactly what the men who built it had hoped. and exactly what the men on the receiving end had feared. This is the point where the whole long chain of engineering finally reached the German soldier in his foxhole, and it is worth pausing inside that moment to understand precisely why his careful preparation betrayed him. For years, the German soldier had learned the same lesson every soldier in every industrial war had learned. When the artillery comes, get below the surface. Fragments from a shell that strikes the ground are thrown up and to the sides. The earth is your shield. Dig deep, get your head down, put something solid overhead if you can, and endure. The deeper the hole, the safer the man. This was not superstition. It was sound, hard-won knowledge, validated by the survival of everyone who had followed it. A German veteran of the Eastern Front, of Normandy, of the long fighting retreat across France, knew in his bones that the bottom of a deep foxhole was the safest place on a bombarded battlefield. The proximity fuse took that knowledge and turned it into a death sentence. When a proximity-fused shell arrived over a position, it did not strike the ground. It sensed the ground approaching and detonated in the air above it, at a height of a few tens of feet, at exactly the altitude that turned the whole surrounding area into a killing zone raked from above. The fragments did not travel outward and upward, they sprayed downward, into every hole, every trench, and every scrape in the earth, onto the men who had done the correct and time-honored thing and gotten below the surface. The deep foxhole, the veteran's refuge, became a trap that funneled the falling steel onto the man crouched at its bottom, and because the shells came in fast and burst above, rather than making the familiar shriek and thud of a ground impact, the soldier often had no warning at all. There was no whistle to drop at, no impact to flinch from. There was only, suddenly, steel falling into a hole that had no roof, or through the gaps in a roof built to stop a threat coming from the side. This is why the German prisoners spoke the way they did. In the interrogation reports gathered that winter, the same bewilderment surfaces again and again. Men who had survived years of bombardment by knowing how to take cover found that taking cover no longer worked, and they could not understand it. They described being dazed, and they described having no defense. Some German units, according to accounts from the fighting, reached a state close to breakdown under this kind of fire, with soldiers reluctant to leave the shelter of their bunkers even when ordered, because there was a growing sense that no shelter was safe and that the shells reached everywhere. The psychological effect compounded the physical one, and in war, the psychological effect can matter as much as the wounds. A soldier's morale rests, in large part, on the belief that his own actions can keep him alive. He digs his hole, he takes his cover, he keeps his head down, and he tells himself that skill and discipline will see him through. That belief is what lets a man endure the terror of a bombardment without breaking. The Airburst shell attacked that belief directly. It did not merely kill more men, it killed them in a way that made a mockery of the very things they did to survive, so that the careful soldier and the careless one shared the same fate, and the deep hole offered no more safety than the shallow one. A danger a man can understand and act against is a danger he can bear, a danger that finds him no matter what he does, that turns his own hard-won craft of survival against him, corrodes something deeper than the body. It corrodes the will to keep fighting. Veterans of that winter's battles, on the German side, carried away from it a particular dread of the American airburst, a sense that against those shells there was nothing a man could do but wait and hope was a thin defense against steel that came down from above. The mechanism that made this possible was not the fuse alone. The fuse was the final, decisive piece bolted onto an artillery system that was already among the finest in the world, and that system deserves to be understood, because without it, the fuse would have been merely a clever gadget, rather than a battlefield revolution. The story of that system begins not on any battlefield, but in the quiet interwar years, in the classrooms and firing ranges of the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, where a small number of American officers spent the lean, unglamorous decade between the wars solving a problem that most armies had barely defined. The problem was speed and coordination. An artillery piece on its own is only as useful as the information that tells it where to shoot. In most armies of the period, an observer who spotted a target had to pass his report up a slow and rigid chain, and each battery of guns worked out its own firing data more or less separately. Bringing the fire of many batteries down onto a single target at a single moment was a laborious affair that could take a long time to arrange, by which point the target had often moved or taken cover. The officers at Fort Sill set out to fix this. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, one director of the gunnery department reformed the techniques by which guns were laid, and his successor created the innovation that mattered most, the Fire Direction Center. The idea was to gather all the calculation for a group of guns into a single command post. An observer would report a target to that one center, and the center, with its own trained crews and firing tables, would compute the data for every gun under its control and order them all to fire together. It sounds simple, stated plainly, but its consequences were enormous, and it took years of patient work by a handful of officers to make it real. They developed new methods and new tools, including graphical firing tables that let a crew compute a firing solution quickly by hand, and they wedded the whole system to the portable radio, so that an observer far forward could speak directly to the center. The result was a way of controlling artillery fire that no other army fully matched. The men at Fort Sill, among them officers whose reforms reshaped the entire branch, had built a system in which a single observer, seeing a target, could telephone or radio one center, and that center could rapidly compute firing data for many batteries at once and bring them all down on the same spot at the same moment. This capability, refined over years of unglamorous peacetime work, gave American artillery two decisive qualities. It was fast, and it was massed. An American forward observer, even a junior officer with a radio, could call for the fire of an entire battalion or more, and have dozens of guns respond within minutes. The technique of timing the shells so that rounds from many scattered batteries all landed on the target in the same instant, giving the enemy no warning to take cover, was so valued that it had its own name. The Americans called it time on target, and it was feared by every enemy who experienced it, because the first warning of the barrage was the barrage itself, arriving all at once from every direction. Now combine that system with the proximity fuse, and you see the full shape of what the German soldier faced. A single American observer spots movement near a tree line, or simply suspects that a hollow or a stretch of forest is occupied. He does not need to see the individual men. He calls the coordinate to the Fire Direction Center. Within minutes, the massed guns of multiple battalions fire, timed so that all the shells arrive together, and every one of those shells is fitted with a fuse that will burst it in the air above the target at the perfect killing height. There is no ranging, no walking the fire in, no slow correction that gives men time to burrow deeper. The first thing that happens is also the decisive thing. Dozens of airbursts blossom overhead at once, and the steel comes straight down into every position in the target area, whether or not anyone in that area was ever actually seen. The forces this unleashed on massed or exposed German troops were annihilating. One episode from the Hurtgen Forest, recorded by an American ordnance officer, describes a German patrol caught in the open by a barrage of these airburst shells. When the position was examined afterward, 96 German dead were counted, and the officer who reported it described the bodies in language too grim to soften, as though they had passed through a machine that ground flesh and steel together. This was not the work of a lucky shot. It was the predictable output of a system designed, from the fuse in the shell to the calculations in the Fire Direction Center, to put lethal steel into a defined patch of ground with a speed and density no soldier caught inside it could survive. If you are still with me at this point, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel is made for. A quick like and a subscribe genuinely help these deep dives reach more people who care about how this war was actually fought, and they make it possible to keep producing them. It was after actions like this that General Patton wrote his famous assessment. In late December, near Echternach on the Sauer River, massed proximity fuzzed fire caught German troops attempting to cross, and Patton wrote afterward that the new shell with the funny fuse was devastating. He recorded that a single battalion concentration had killed 700 of the enemy by actual count in that one action, and he offered the judgment that when every army eventually possessed this shell, warfare itself would have to be reinvented, because the ancient relationship between the soldier and his cover had been broken. He added that he was glad the Americans had thought of it first. It is worth being careful with Patton's enthusiasm here. He was describing the effect of a single fire mission that he had seen the results of, not delivering a considered verdict on the whole campaign, and the count of the dead is his own figure from the moment. Still, Patton was not a sentimental man about equipment. His entire reputation rested on the aggressive movement of men and tanks, on will and speed and the offensive spirit. That such a man singled out a fuse, a small technical device, as a thing that changed the fundamental nature of combat tells you how profound the change actually was. The chief scientist who had overseen the mobilization of American research judged that the proximity fuse had made 3 great contributions to the war. It had defended the fleet in the Pacific, where it would later prove vital against the suicide aircraft attacks of the war's final year. It had helped shield England from the flying bombs, and it had struck the German army on the ground in the last campaigns in Europe. Each of these was significant. Together they represented a return on the $1 billion and the years of secret labor that few weapons in history could match. Now step back and consider the deeper question, the one that reaches past this single weapon and explains why the German army, for all its genius, had no answer. Because the German army was not backward, and it was not lacking in talent. In many areas of weapons design, the Germans led the world. They fielded the first operational jet fighters, the first ballistic missiles, some of the finest tanks and optics and machine guns of the war. If any army should have been able to match an American technical achievement, it was the German one. And yet in this case they were left entirely without a response, not because they could not imagine the weapon, but because of a series of choices and constraints that ran far deeper than any single engineering problem. The first reason was the choice made early in the war, when Germany was winning, to concentrate on weapons that could be finished quickly and to set aside the long, hard, uncertain projects. The proximity fuse was exactly the kind of project that suffered under such a policy. It required years of patient, expensive, failure-ridden development with no guarantee of success. A nation confident of imminent victory sees little reason to fund such things, and Germany, in its victorious years, chose the quick weapon over the patient one. By the time the war turned and the patient weapons were desperately wanted, the years needed to build them were gone. The second reason was industrial. Even if German engineers had perfected a proximity fuse design, mass-producing it was a challenge of an entirely different order, and it was suited to exactly the kind of economy Germany did not have by the end of the war. The American fuse was not the product of a single brilliant laboratory. It was the product of the largest and most flexible consumer electronics industry on Earth, an industry of dozens of companies and factories that in peacetime built radios and appliances by the million, and could be turned to building rugged little radios for shells by the million. Germany's electronics industry was smaller, and by the last years of the war it was being pounded from the air, starved of raw materials, and stripped of skilled workers for the front. The German war economy could barely sustain the weapons it already had. It could not have added the mass production of tens of millions of precision electronic fuses, even had the design been ready. The third reason cuts deepest of all, and it is the reason this story matters beyond the specifics of one shell. The two armies had organized their entire approaches to warfare around different assumptions about where the decisive advantage lay. German military culture placed its faith, brilliantly and with real justification, in the individual soldier and the individual commander, in initiative and aggression and tactical skill at the point of contact. The German army trained its junior leaders to think for themselves, to seize opportunities, to fight with a flexibility and ferocity that Allied soldiers often found terrifying. This was a genuine strength, and it won the Germans countless local victories throughout the war. But it was an approach that located combat power in the man and his immediate decisions. The American approach, by contrast, increasingly located combat power in the system, in a vast, coordinated machine designed and built long before any particular battle, into which the individual soldier fitted as one component. The fire direction center, the proximity fuse, the time-on-target technique, the industrial base that produced shells and fuses without apparent limit. These were not things a brilliant lieutenant improvised in the heat of an engagement. They were things engineered over years by institutions, and they arrived on the battlefield as finished capabilities that any lieutenant with a radio could summon. The German soldier in his foxhole was among the best trained and most tactically capable infantrymen in the world. It did him no good at all, because the thing that killed him was not another soldier he could outfight. It was a system he could not outthink, reaching him from miles away, through the air, in the form of steel, falling out of an empty sky. That is the real answer to why German troops had no response to the secret Airburst shells. It was not a failure of German courage, or German skill, or even German science in the narrow sense. It was that the weapon was the visible tip of an entire way of making war that Germany had not built, and, by the last winter of the conflict, could no longer hope to build. The fuse was one small device. Behind it stood the tizard trunk carried across the ocean, the 1,000 people of Section T, the ruggedized vacuum tubes and the ingenious shattering battery, the 100 factories, the $1 billion, the 2 years of guarded secrecy, and the field artillery doctrine perfected on the plains of Oklahoma across a decade of peace. A soldier cannot dig a hole deep enough to hide from all of that. There is a final thought worth holding on to, and it reaches beyond this war entirely. The German soldier believed, as soldiers had believed for a generation, that safety was a matter of position. Get low enough, get deep enough, put enough earth between yourself and the guns, and you would live. It was a belief about the physical world, and within the world he had known it was true. The proximity fuse did not disprove his courage or his craft. It disproved his assumption about the shape of danger. He had prepared, with great skill, for a threat that came from the side. The threat came from above. Everything he did to protect himself against the world as he understood it made him more vulnerable to the world as it had actually become. That is the quiet lesson buried in this piece of forgotten engineering. The men who died in those excellent foxholes were not beaten by braver soldiers or by better tactics. They were beaten by a change in the rules that they did not know had occurred, a change worked out in laboratories and factories an ocean away, by people they never saw, solving a problem their own experts had judged not worth the effort. By the time the steel came down out of the sky, the argument was already long over. It had been settled years earlier, in the choice between the quick weapon and the patient one, between the gifted individual and the coordinated system, between concluding that a hard thing was impossible and deciding, against all the odds, to build it anyway. The proximity fuse was never a miracle. It was the product of a very particular set of decisions, made far from any battlefield, about what was worth attempting, and what was worth funding, and what was worth keeping secret until the decisive hour. The German soldier in the Hurtgen forest paid the price of the opposite decisions, made years before by men in his own country who could not have known that a policy of abandoning the slow projects would one day leave their infantry exposed under a sky full of falling steel. He did everything right. The world had simply changed underneath him, and no one had told him, and by the time he understood, there was no hole deep enough to matter. If this account gave you something to think about, a like helps it reach more people, and subscribing means you will not miss the next deep dive into the hidden engineering and hard decisions that shaped how this war was really fought and won.